Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about a forbidden love that turned a slave into a plantation mistress that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled, and if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder. Don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing before its secrets were disturbed. The old Richmond courthouse was a monument to forgetting. For generations, it had stood as a stoic, silent witness to the city's tumultuous history, its stone steps worn smooth by the passage of lawyers and judges, criminals and victims, slaves and masters. By the sweltering summer of 2003, it was a relic, a grand old dame of Southern Gothic architecture awaiting a careful, modern touch, a team of historical preservationists, tasked with stabilizing its foundation and restoring its faded grandeur, moved through its cavernous, echoing halls with the reverence typically reserved for cathedrals. They were not mere construction workers, they were curators of time, and they understood that a building like this held more than just brick and mortar. It held stories. On a particularly oppressive July afternoon, as the air hung thick and still, their work led them to the main chamber. It was here, beneath the vacant gaze of long-dead magistrates whose portraits lined the walls, that they carefully pried loose the time-worn floorboards. The foreman, a man named Miller, who had spent 30 years uncovering the hidden skeletons of old buildings, felt a change in the resonance of his tools. A hollow sound echoed from below, brushing away a century's worth of fine, grey dust. They uncovered a hidden recess, a small, dark void between the massive foundation stones, and nestled within it lay a small, lead-lined box. Its surface was tarnished with the patient, beautiful artistry of time. Its very presence an anomaly, a question mark in the building's official blueprints. There was no record of its existence. It was not a time capsule, placed with ceremony, but something hidden, something deliberately intended to be lost forever. With a collective breath held in the humid air, the seal was broken. The scent that arose was not of treasure, but of time itself, the dry, faint perfume of decaying paper and faded ink inside, resting on a bed of brittle, yellowed newspapers heralding the end of the Civil War, were two bundles of documents. The first was a collection of private letters, their pages filled with the elegant, cascading script of a high-ranking Confederate officer, Colonel William Ashford, a name known to local history. The second, a formal confession, penned with a steady, almost unnervingly composed hand, by a woman known to the law only as Celeste. Together, these fragile papers did more than just whisper an old story. They screamed a truth so profound it threatened to rewrite history itself. They spoke of a forbidden love that blossomed in the ashes of the Old South, a desperate union that defied every law of God and man. They chronicled an audacious masquerade, a performance of identity so convincing it fooled an entire society. And finally, they revealed a heart-wrenching sacrifice, a mother's ultimate act of love to protect the future of children she would never know. For these documents were the final testament of a woman born into the absolute powerlessness of slavery, who had not only become the secret mistress of a grand plantation, but was also the mother of two children who would rise to the highest echelons of power. One, a celebrated Massachusetts state senator, a fiery orator whose passionate advocacy for civil rights had defined his career. The other, a pioneering suffragette and educator in Boston, a woman whose work would empower thousands. They were children who would live their entire, remarkable lives as pillars of their communities, celebrated and revered, without ever knowing the name, the face, or the incredible, brutal cost of the love that gave them life. How could a story of this magnitude be so completely, so surgically erased from the historical record? To find the answer, we must journey back to the raw, wounded landscape of 1865 and to a place that was, itself, a tomb of a dying dream, a plantation known as Ashford Manor. In the spring of that year, Ashford Manor was not a home. It was a corpse awaiting a burial, located in the war-ravaged heart of Henrico County. This grand estate was a perfect, decaying monument to the Confederacy's fall. To walk its grounds was to walk through a gallery of ruin. The morning mist, thick and spectral, clung to its crumbling Doric columns like a shroud, and the once proud white paint on its facade peeled away in leprous patches, revealing the dark, rotting timber beneath, like bones showing through skin. The grand ballroom, where the music of waltzes had once spilled out into the night, now stood silent and empty, its floor coated in a fine layer of dust that held the faint footprints of rodents, its crystal chandelier hanging askew, draped in cobwebs like a grotesque jewel. The nursery on the second floor was a place of particular sorrow, where two small, empty beds served as a constant, aching reminder of the sons the war had consumed. Outside, the formal gardens, where generations of Virginia's elite had once strolled, had surrendered to a riot of brambles and thorns. Nature, in its indifferent way, was reclaiming the land, its wild growth choking the life from the last of the manicured roses that the late Mrs. Ashford had so lovingly tended, the long, majestic oak-lined drive. Once a symbol of immense wealth and power, now seemed to lead only to a place of profound and unsettling silence. This was Virginia in the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the Civil War. It was a landscape of a fragile, bitter peace, where the surrender at Appomattox had ended the fighting but had resolved almost nothing. The Confederate dollar was worthless. The economy was shattered, and a new, unwelcome class of northern opportunists, the so-called carpetbaggers, were descending to pick at the bones of the old aristocracy. The social order was in free fall. For the thousands of newly freed African Americans, liberty was a bewildering and terrifying mirage. It was a word that promised everything but provided nothing: no land, no money, no vote, and certainly no protection from the simmering, venomous resentment of their former masters. The records of the Freedmen's Bureau from that period are filled with accounts of this chaotic limbo, a world where families, separated for decades, searched desperately for one another on roads clogged with both hope and despair. For the white plantation owners like those at Ashford Manor, the world had been violently inverted. They were aristocrats of a fallen kingdom, adrift in a new reality they could neither comprehend nor accept, clinging to the wreckage of their ideology. This volatile, uncertain environment, where the old rules were dead, but new ones had not yet been born, was the fertile ground upon which the impossible story of Ashford Manor would grow. It was a place where desperation could be mistaken for affection, and survival could necessitate the most extraordinary of deceptions. And within these decaying walls, two souls navigated the wreckage of their lives, bound together by a dynamic that defied every convention of their time, a relationship that was, in itself, a quiet, dangerous rebellion. The first was Colonel William Ashford, at 53. He was a man hollowed out by grief, a walking spectre haunting the grand rooms of his own home. He had once been a formidable figure, a respected commander known for his strategic mind. But the war had taken more than just his cause. It had taken his sons, James and Robert. turning them from vibrant young men into names etched on a family monument. A virulent fever had stolen his gentle wife, Margaret, shortly after, leaving him utterly, terrifyingly alone. He was the sole patriarch of a ruined legacy, and the weight of it had broken him. His days fell into a rigid, sorrowful ritual. He would rise late, ignore the meager breakfast laid out for him, and retire to his study. There, surrounded by the leather-bound books he no longer read and the portraits of the dead who stared back at him with silent judgment, he would begin to drink. Each evening, as dusk bled across the Virginia sky, he would pour 2 glasses of bourbon, one for himself, and one he would place on the mantel beneath the portrait of his eldest son, James. He would then speak to the painting for hours, a low, rambling monologue of regrets and memories, a conversation with a ghost. This was not the behavior of a fearsome plantation master. It was the slow, deliberate suicide of a man's spirit. His well-known leniency towards his slaves was not born of progressive ideals, but was rather a symptom of this profound, bone-deep weariness. He no longer possessed the energy for tyranny. The other soul, the quiet center of this collapsing universe, was Celeste. At 22, she was legally William's property, a name on a bill of sale, an asset he had purchased when she was a girl of 14. But in the reality of their daily lives, she had become the manor's anchor. While William drifted in his sea of sorrow, it was Celeste who held the place together. It was Celeste who knew how to stretch the dwindling food supplies, how to negotiate with the few remaining merchants who would still offer credit, how to manage the handful of former slaves who now worked for negligible wages, taught to read and write in secret by the late, kind-hearted Mrs. Ashford. Celeste possessed a razor-sharp intellect that she kept carefully veiled behind a mask of quiet, deferential servitude. She lived a life of dual consciousness outwardly. She was the silent, efficient house servant. Inwardly, her mind was a whirlwind of calculations, strategies, and silent observations. This was never more apparent than when dealing with the vultures circling the estate. Months earlier, a sly creditor had arrived, claiming an old, inflated debt and threatening seizure of the remaining livestock. William, in his fog of grief, was ready to concede. But it was Celeste who, from the shadows of the hallway, had slipped him a note. On it was a date and a ledger number. Armed with this information, William had been able to produce a receipt proving the majority of the debt had been paid years prior, stunning the creditor into a hasty retreat. He never asked how she knew. He didn't need to. He was the master in title, but she was the master of his survival. Theirs was a relationship of profound and perilous codependency. It was a silent, unspoken arrangement that would have been anathema to their neighbors. A social heresy. He was a drowning man, and she was the only one who knew how to navigate the currents. She, in turn, found in his dependence a fragile shield against the world's brutality. It was a dangerous deviation from the natural order, a quiet secret festering in a house full of ghosts, and the first, unsettling portent of the devastating storm that was to come. The breaking point, the first tremor of the coming storm, arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, final scratch of a pen on a bleak winter's night. The fragile peace that had settled over Ashford Manor was an illusion, a thin layer of ice over a deep, turbulent sea of debt, and that night, the ice finally cracked. Celeste found Colonel Ashford in his study, not merely drunk, but utterly consumed by a grief that had finally curdled into a raw, terrifying despair. He was slumped over his great mahogany desk, a fortress of his former authority, now reduced to the last bastion of his ruin. Spread before him, like a fan of tarot cards predicting doom, were not letters from the front, but official notices of foreclosure. They're cold, printed words stark against the flickering lamplight. They were legal vultures, circling the last vestiges of the Ashford name, and they were about to descend. "They're going to take it all. Celeste," he said, his voice a ragged whisper that barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the air. He didn't look up. His gaze was fixed on a specific document, a final notice from the bank that had financed his family for 3 generations. Everything. The land my grandfather tamed, the house my father built. Gone. He swept a trembling hand across the papers, scattering the death notices of his legacy. In that moment, stripped of his rank, his pride, and his hope, he was not her master. He was simply a man at the end of his world, and it was her, in this crucible of ultimate despair, that Celeste made a choice that would forever alter the trajectory of their lives. It was a decision forged in 8 years of silent observation. A calculated gamble that could either lead to her utter destruction or to an unimaginable form of liberation. She could have retreated, a ghost returning to the shadows, leaving him to his sorrow as any slave was expected to do. Instead, she stepped forward, her presence a sudden, resolute anchor in the chaotic storm of his emotions. "There may be a way," she said, her voice quiet but imbued with a strange, resonant authority that cut through his alcoholic haze. He looked up then, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus on her, and for the first time, he seemed to see beyond the servant's uniform, to the formidable intelligence housed within. "I have been keeping the real books," she confessed, the words a torrent of carefully guarded secrets, from a hollowed-out copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations on a Forgotten Shelf. She retrieved it. It was another ledger, identical on the outside to the one on his desk, but its pages told a different story. While his book was a chaotic narrative of decline, hers was a meticulous, secret history of the plantation's true financial life. In her elegant, precise script were records of mismanaged funds that could be recalled, assets he had long forgotten, hidden caches of coin, and a detailed plan of expenses that could be cut. It was a blueprint for survival. That night, the vast social, racial, and power imbalanced gulf between them collapsed into the space of a single desk. The study was no longer a master's sanctuary. It had become a conspirator's den. For the first time, William Ashford and the woman the world defined as his property sat side by side, equals in a desperate plot against oblivion. Night after night, that study became their world, a clandestine island of strategy in a sea of decay. The rest of the house would fall into a deep, haunted sleep, but behind the heavy velvet drapes of the study, a quiet, intense revolution was underway. Their sessions began with the cold, hard language of numbers, Celeste's slender finger tracing a line across a page, her voice a calm, steady current as she explained the flow of capital, debt, and potential. She possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of the land and its people, a knowledge that William, for all his heritage, had never truly grasped. He, in turn, began to emerge from the suffocating fog of his grief. The commander within him, long dormant, began to stir as he recognized the sheer brilliance of her strategies. The dynamic between them shifted with every passing evening. He was no longer the master giving orders, but the student, listening with rapt attention as she taught him the true nature of his own inheritance. But as the weeks bled into months, the nature of their conversations began to evolve, moving from the tangible to the intangible, from the language of ledgers to the language of the soul. The cold barrier of finance and strategy started to melt under the sustained heat of their shared purpose and profound isolation. It began subtly. A discussion about a timber contract on the northern tract would lead William to a quiet, painful memory of teaching his son James to ride a horse through those same woods. He would fall silent, his gaze lost in the flickering flames of the hearth, and for the first time, he spoke of them to her, not as a master reciting a lineage, but as a father confessing a wound that would not heal. He spoke of his guilt, of the patriotic fervor with which he had sent them to their deaths, a sacrifice he now saw as a pointless waste. Celeste, in turn, found herself responding not with the placating murmurs of a servant, but with a quiet, profound empathy. She, too, knew the ache of things lost, of a life that could have been, and so she began to share carefully chosen fragments of her own hidden world. She spoke of her mother, sold away when she was a child, and of a recurring dream of standing before the ocean, a body of water she had never seen, feeling its immense, untamable freedom. They were two profoundly lonely people, trapped in a house of ghosts. And in that small, lamp-lit room, they found in each other a solace, a mirroring of their own brokenness, that the outside world would have deemed an abomination. The pressure of their shared secrets, their intellectual intimacy, and their crushing loneliness began to build, creating a charge in the air that was both terrifying and irresistible. It culminated on a warm night in late March, the scent of dogwood blossoms and damp earth drifting through the open window, a fragrant promise of a spring they might not live to see. They had just finished outlining a plan to restructure his most significant debt, a small but critical victory. He looked up from the ledger, but his eyes were not on the numbers. They were on her, and in his gaze, she saw the last wall between them finally crumble. It was not the predatory gaze of a master, but the desperate, pleading look of a man who saw his only salvation. He said her name, a single word, soft as a prayer. Celeste. And in the silence that followed, a silence thick with the unspoken weight of history and taboo, Celeste made another choice. She did not say no. She did not have to. The coming together was not an act of submission, but a silent, mutual surrender to the inevitable, a desperate, gentle collision of two souls who had found in each other the only refuge left in a collapsing world. In the flickering firelight, on the floor of his study, the last and most dangerous taboo was broken, and the conspiracy of finance became a conspiracy of the heart. The consequence of that surrender did not announce itself with violence or fanfare. It began as a whisper in Celeste's own body, a subtle, internal rebellion that she, having witnessed it countless times among the women in the slave quarters, recognized with a jolt of ice-cold dread. It was an unmistakable quickening, the first faint flutter of a new life, a life that was both a miracle and a death sentence. For weeks, she carried this knowledge alone, a secret within a secret, a growing terror that coiled in her belly with each passing sunrise. Every morning, wave of nausea was a reminder of the impossible reality of a situation. This was not a secret that could be hidden in a ledger or confined to the late hours of the study. This was a living, breathing truth that would soon make itself known to the world, a child whose very existence would be an accusation. Her mind, ever the strategist, raced through the catastrophic possibilities, each one a path to ruin. She could run, join the streams of freed slaves heading north, and disappear into the chaos of Reconstruction. But she envisioned the life that awaited a fugitive, alone, with a child of mixed heritage that would mark her as an outcast in both black and white communities. Or she could remain silent and hope to pass the child off as belonging to another. But she knew the cruel arithmetic of genetics. One look at the baby's features could betray them both, leading to a brutal punishment for her and shame for him. Finally, there was the most dangerous option of all to tell him. It was a test of the fragile, unnamed bond they had forged in the firelight. It was a wager on the soul of William Ashford. She chose truth, not out of faith, but out of the desperate hope that the conspiracy had become something more. She found him in the library, the evening rain drumming against the window panes like nervous fingers, the sound mirroring the frantic beating of her own heart. She stood before him, her hands clasped to stop their trembling, and spoke the words that would irrevocably alter the course of both their lives. "I am with child," she said, her voice clear and steady, a marvel of control. "And it is yours." The book he was reading, a volume of Greek philosophy, fell from his hands, landing on the carpet with a soft thud that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden, deafening silence. His face was a canvas of cascading emotions: shock, disbelief, a flicker of something that looked like awestruck joy, immediately extinguished by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated terror. He saw the future in an instant, the scandal, the ruin, the condemnation. But then, another image fought its way through the panic: a child, an heir, a continuation of a line he thought had ended in the bloody fields of Pennsylvania. This was the true climax of their story thus far. This was the moment the secret world they had built together collided with the brutal, unforgiving reality of the world outside. The question that hung in the air between them was not one of love or betrayal, but of survival. And it was in this moment of ultimate crisis that William Ashford, the broken colonel, finally shed the skin of his grief and despair. A new, frantic energy ignited in his eyes, a desperate brilliance she had never seen before. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, not in denial of the child, but in defiance of the fate that awaited it. "My child will not be born a slave." He began pacing the room, no longer a defeated man, but commander planning an impossible campaign. "New Orleans," he muttered, the words coming fast, seizing on a sliver of knowledge. "The laws are different there. The Creoles, the gens de couleur libre. Society is more fluid. The chaos of the war. Families scattered. Identities lost and remade." He turned to her, his eyes wild with the fever of a desperate, audacious new hope. "You will not be Celeste, the slave," he declared, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction that startled them both. "You will be Celeste Stein Ashford, my distant cousin from Louisiana, a widow, her own family lost to the fever. And you, and our child, have come home. The masquerade, the great, tragic performance of their lives, had just been born." The masquerade began not with a grand announcement, but with an act of ritual purification, a baptism by fire in the dead of night, in the great hearth of the study, the same fireplace that had borne witness to their desperate union. William and Celeste systematically destroyed a life, piece by piece. They fed the flames with the meager artifacts of Celeste, the slave, the rough-spun cotton dresses, the worn-out shoes, and finally, the most damning document of all, her bill of sale. They watched as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, the ink that legally defined her as human property dissolving into nothingness. It was a funeral pyre for a ghost, a desperate, defiant act of erasure. But as the last embers died down, a cold reality settled in the room. Destroying a past is simple, but fabricating a new one is a far more perilous art. What followed was a meticulous, high-stakes construction of a phantom. This was not a simple change of clothes. It was the forging of a soul. William, using his remaining connections, procured dresses of fine silk and polished cotton from Richmond, in colors and styles that slaves were forbidden to even touch. He taught her how to walk, not with the efficient, quiet steps of a servant, but with the measured, graceful gait of a lady of leisure. He hired a discreet, elderly tutor, a man ruined by the war and willing to ask no questions, to help her sand the rough edges from a dialect, to soften her country Virginia accent into the more fluid, vaguely French-inflected tones one might expect from a woman of New Orleans society. Night after night, they would study, not ledgers, but maps of New Orleans, memorizing street names, prominent families, and social customs. He was creating a history for her, a tapestry of plausible fictions to shield them from the world's scrutiny. The most critical piece of this fabricated evidence, however, could not be bought or taught. It had to be consecrated. On a humid night in May, deep in the cypress swamps that bordered the plantation, they enacted the most sacred and illegal ritual of their lives. William had found a preacher, an old blind slave named Moses, a man whose authority came not from any church, but from decades of ministering to the spiritual needs of the enslaved community, by the flickering, primal light of pine knot torches, surrounded by the chorus of night birds and the splash of unseen things in the dark water. William Ashford and Celeste spoke vows that were a direct act of treason against the social order of Virginia. Moses bound their hands together with a strip of cloth blessed with prayers and tears, and in the eyes of a God that the white world had largely ignored, he pronounced them husband and wife. William slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a circle of irrefutable, physical evidence of their commitment. As the metal touched her skin, Celeste felt the last, invisible chains of her old life fall away. She was no longer a slave. She was Celestine Ashford. And now she had to convince the world. Her transformation was agonizing. The remaining house servants, who had known her as an equal, now looked at her with a toxic mixture of confusion, resentment, and fear. Old Sarah, the cook who had once shared stories with her over the kitchen fire, now offered a stiff, formal curtsy, her eyes cold and hard. To them, Celeste had not escaped bondage. She had become the enemy. She learned quickly that kindness was perceived as weakness. To maintain the fiction, to command the authority of Madame Ashford, she had to become someone she did not recognize. She had to learn the cruel language of command, the icy tone of dismissal, the hard gaze of a mistress. Each time she gave an order that caused a former friend to flinch. A piece of her own soul withered. She was playing a part, but the performance was slowly consuming the person underneath as the child grew within her, a visible testament to the secret she was protecting. So too did the weight of her deception. She was building a fortress to protect her family, but she was walling herself inside it, alone. For 2 years, the fortress held. Their son, James William Ashford, was born in the winter of 1865, his skin pale enough, his features ambiguous enough to pass. The fiction solidified into a fragile reality, but they had underestimated the persistence of hatred. The dark unveiling came on a sweltering July morning in 1867, arriving in the form of a man on horseback, Thomas Hartwell. Hartwell owned the adjacent plantation, a bitter, resentful man who had lost his fortune and his sons to a war he still refused to believe was over. He was a guardian of the old ways, a self-appointed inquisitor of the new, fractured society. And from the very beginning, he had watched the sudden appearance of William's cousin with a cold, predatory suspicion. He was welcomed into the parlor, the heart of their sanctuary. He sat, a vulture in a gentleman's suit, his pale eyes taking in every detail the fine dress Celestine wore, the confident way she managed the household, and most of all, the beautiful, bright-eyed 2-year-old boy playing at her feet. The polite conversation was a thin veneer over a simmering, unspoken hostility. Hartwell spoke of crop prices and politics, but his gaze kept returning to James, studying him with the calculating eye of a man searching for a flaw in a masterpiece. Then, with the casual cruelty of a cat toying with a mouse, he dropped his weapon. "A remarkable boy," Hartwell said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "He has his father's eyes, to be sure, but his exotic beauty is all from you. Celestine, or should I perhaps say Celeste?" The name, her true name, landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. It was an accusation, a declaration of war. William rose to his feet, his face flushed with a sudden, protective rage. "How dare you?" he began, but Hartwell simply raised a hand, silencing him from the inside pocket of his coat. He withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. He smoothed it open on the table. It was the irrefutable, concrete evidence they had burned in the fire 2 years ago. But it was not the original. It was a certified copy, obtained from the estate records of the man who had sold Celeste to William a decade prior. A slave bill of sale for one female slave named Celeste. Hartwell read aloud, his voice dripping with triumph. "Age 14. Distinguishing marks a small crescent-shaped scar on the left shoulder." His eyes flickered towards her shoulder, a spot covered by the silk of her dress. Celeste's hand moved involuntarily, a tiny self-betraying gesture to cover the mark she had gotten as a child. Falling from a ladder while picking apples, Hartwell's smile widened. He had her. "The document is genuine. William," he continued, his voice low and menacing, "I've had it authenticated. Your lovely wife, your lady of quality from New Orleans, is nothing more than your property, a runaway slave playing a very elaborate game." His gaze then shifted, with theatrical cruelty, to the small boy who was now clinging to his mother's skirts, sensing the sudden terror in the room. "And that," Hartwell said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, "makes your beautiful, pale-skinned heir a bastard and a slave by Virginia law." The silence that followed was absolute, a perfect vacuum in which their carefully constructed world imploded, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. What followed was not an explosion of rage, but the cold, suffocating pressure of a trap sprung shut. "What do you want, Hartwell?" William finally asked, his voice tight with a rage so profound it was almost silent. Hartwell leaned back, the picture of victorious satisfaction. "What I want," he replied simply, "is for the natural order to be restored. It is an abomination, William, a slave elevated above her station, given authority over white folk, bearing a child who dares to carry a white man's name. It is a poison that must be purged." He laid out his terms with the precision of a hangman. It was not blackmail for money. It was a demand for total, unconditional surrender. He wanted Celeste returned to her proper place, not as a slave, for that was now illegal, but as a disgraced woman, publicly exposed and cast out. He wanted her child, James, declared illegitimate, stripped of the Ashford name and any claim to inheritance. And he wanted Ashford Manor itself sold, its lands passing to a man who, like him, understood how the world was supposed to work. If they refused, he would take his evidence, the bill of sale, his testimony to the county sheriff, to the newspapers, to every pillar of Virginia society. He would not just expose them, he would utterly destroy them, making them pariahs in a society that was already looking for scapegoats to blame for its downfall. After he left, giving them 24 hours to comply, William and Celeste sat in the stunned, ringing silence of their ruined parlor. The room that had been their sanctuary now felt like a tomb. The option of running was a fleeting fantasy, discussed and dismissed in desperate whispers. With what money? To where their deception had only worked because they had stayed still, hiding in plain sight. To run would be to invite scrutiny, and another Thomas Hartwell would surely be waiting in whatever town they landed in. As night fell, a new, even more terrifying realization dawned upon them. The greatest threat was not to their reputation, but to their son. Under the still enforced racial integrity laws of Virginia, their secret marriage was legally void. James was, as Hartwell had so cruelly pointed out, illegitimate. Worse, any child born to an enslaved woman, even after emancipation, could have their legal status challenged, potentially dragging them into a hellish legal limbo. Their son's entire future, his identity, his freedom, was balanced on a knife's edge. It was in that moment of absolute despair that Celeste's strategic mind, honed by a lifetime of survival, formulated its last, most brilliant, and most heartbreaking gambit. "You were deceived," she said quietly into the darkness, her voice devoid of all emotion. William looked at her, confused. "That will be our story," she continued, her plan forming as she spoke. "I will confess. I will say that I was an impostor, that I found the papers of your real cousin, Celeste Stein, who died of the fever in New Orleans. I took her identity and I took her child. I claimed James as my own to make the deception more convincing." William stared at her, horrified, as the sheer sacrificial brilliance of her plan became clear. It was a masterful lie. It would save him from the crime of miscegenation. It would save their home from Hartwell's grasp. And most importantly, it would permanently and irrevocably cement James's identity as a legitimate, white Ashford heir, the son of a tragic, deceased cousin, completely untainted by his mother's true bloodline. It was a plan that required her to sacrifice everything: her name, her love, her relationship with the son, and, ultimately, her life. It was the only move she had left. By morning, the whispers had already begun to travel from the kitchens of Ashford Manor to the town nearby. The scandal, fed by Hartwell's careful leaks, was spreading like wildfire, and the community, hungry for a villain, was ready to pass judgment. The wheels of a certain, brutal kind of justice were already beginning to turn. The group of men entered the house not with the deference of guests, but with the grim purpose of an occupying force. Their muddy boots made a mockery of the polished floors that Celeste had, in 2 different lifetimes, both cleaned as a slave and managed as a mistress. They found her in the parlor, standing straight and composed, dressed in a simple but elegant day dress. She was not crying. She was not pleading. She looked, to all appearances, like the lady of the house calmly awaiting visitors. In the doorway leading to the back stairs stood William, his face a pale, taut mask of anguish, holding his son James, whose small face was buried in his father's shoulder, shielded from the terrible energy that had invaded their home. It was Thomas Hartwell who spoke first, his voice thick with the triumph of a battle won. "Well, Celeste," he said, drawing out her true name with relish, "I trust you've had time to consider your situation." "I have," she replied, her voice carrying through the room with a clarity that startled them all. "And I have decided to tell the truth." A murmur went through the assembled planters, a mixture of disappointment that there would be no fight, and a salacious eagerness to hear the confession that would confirm their darkest, most prejudiced assumptions. William's eyes met hers for a fleeting, agonizing moment. This was it. The performance of their lives was about to begin. "The truth," Celeste continued, her gaze steady and unwavering, "is that I am indeed the woman described in that bill of sale. I was born a slave, and I have deceived you all. She then proceeded to deliver the masterful, heartbreaking lie she had constructed in the depths of her despair. She confessed to being a fraud, an impostor. She told them how she had learned of the death of Colonel Ashford's distant cousin, the real Celeste Stein, during the yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans. With cold, convincing detail, she explained how she had stolen the woman's identity, traveled to Virginia, and used the colonel's grief to insinuate herself into his home. "And the child?" Sheriff Morrison asked, his voice carefully neutral. Sensing the legal quagmire before him, this was the hardest part, the lie that was a blade to her own heart. "The child," Celeste said, her voice never wavering, "is Colonel Ashford's son by his legitimate cousin, the true Celeste Stein. I claimed her child as my own to make my deception absolute." The lie was a work of genius in its cruelty. It explained James's existence, his light skin, his place in the house, while surgically removing any taint of illegitimacy or mixed blood. It redefined her not as a lover, but as a monstrous, calculating thief. The trial that followed, according to the Richmond court records, was a mere formality, a piece of legal theater designed to quickly and brutally reassert the social order. William, his soul fracturing with every word, played his part. He testified that he had been utterly deceived, his grief manipulated by a woman of stunning cunning. His performance was tragically convincing because the pain in his voice was real, not the pain of a man who had been fooled, but of a man forced to publicly deny and condemn the only person he truly loved. The sentence was swift and brutal, designed to send a message to any other person of color who might dare to dream above their station, for the crimes of fraud and impersonation against a white family. Celeste was to be imprisoned until the birth of the child she was now visibly carrying, and then she was to be executed. As they led her away in chains, her composure finally broke for a single, shattering moment. Her eyes found James, who was now crying, reaching for her with small hands that didn't understand why his mother, the center of his world, was being taken away. "Mama!" he cried, the word a dagger that would remain embedded in her memory. William turned away, his face a mask of stone, a necessary cruelty that felt like a physical blow. The fortress they had built had not just been breached, it had been razed to the ground, and she was buried in the rubble, in the cold, damp cell of the Richmond Penitentiary. Celeste gave birth to a second child, a daughter. She arrived in the spring of 1867, a small, perfect being with her father's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair. This child was the final, secret testament to their impossible love, and a complication the law had not anticipated. Celeste held her for 3 days. A lifetime of love poured into 72 hours. She nursed her, sang her the same lullabies she had sung to James, and memorized every detail of her perfect face. She named her Hope. Then, as arranged by a series of secret, desperate letters from William, the infant was taken away. She was adopted by a wealthy, childless abolitionist couple in Boston, the Pittons, who were told only that the child was the orphan of a respectable Virginia family ruined by the war. She would grow up free, white, and utterly ignorant of her true parentage. Celeste's execution took place on a cold, gray morning in February 1868. It was a quiet, bureaucratic affair. There were no crowds, no newspaper reporters. Society had already consumed her story and moved on. She was simply a problem to be eliminated, a loose thread to be snipped from the fabric of their restored order. As she stood on the scaffold, the historical accounts state that she was calm. Her final thoughts were not of fear, but of a fierce, triumphant satisfaction. Her children would live. James would grow up as the legitimate, undisputed heir to Ashford Manor, educated, privileged, and free. Hope would have opportunities in the North that no slave's daughter could ever dream of. She had paid the ultimate price, but her children would live in the light. and that was a victory that even death could not diminish. William Ashford lived for another 21 years, but in truth, he had died with her. He became the silent, solitary keeper of their secret, a ghost haunting the halls of his own home. He never remarried, and raised James with a fierce, almost suffocating devotion, pouring all of his lost love for Celeste into the boy who was her living legacy. He died in 1889, a respected but remote figure, taking the full truth of his life to his grave. Thomas Hartwell, the architect of their destruction, lived to see his own ruin. The scandal he had gleefully unleashed had unexpected consequences, tearing the fabric of their small community apart with suspicion and recrimination. He died alone and bitter, his own plantation failing, a man consumed by the very hatred he had so eagerly wielded. And the children, the reason for it all, lived lives of stunning, poignant irony. James William Ashford, believing himself to be the pure-blooded son of a Southern aristocrat, was educated at Harvard. He became a brilliant lawyer and politician in Massachusetts, and was eventually elected as a state senator. A passionate reformer known for his fiery speeches advocating for civil rights and education for the recently freed slaves, never understanding the deep, personal connection he felt to their cause. Hope Ashford, raised as a Patton in Boston, became a formidable figure in her own right, a passionate teacher and a leading voice in the women's suffrage movement. Historical records note her particular compassion for orphaned children of mixed heritage, though she never knew why their struggles spoke so deeply to her own heart. The two siblings, James and Hope, never learned of the other's existence. And yet, one afternoon in 1895, at a political rally for universal suffrage in Boston, they passed within a few feet of each other. Witnesses later claimed that for a brief, strange moment, the senator paused and looked at the determined woman with the placard, a flicker of inexplicable recognition in their shared blue eyes, as if some deep, dormant knowledge stirred in their blood. But the moment passed. They turned and continued on their separate, successful paths, two halves of a single, tragic story, forever unknown to each other. For more than a century, that was where the story ended. It fragmented into whispers and legends, a ghost story about a woman in white who walked the ruined grounds of Ashford Manor, an official court record of a devious slave who committed fraud, and the celebrated public histories of two remarkable New England reformers. The truth, in all its complexity and heartbreak, lay silent, buried in the dark. It remained there until that sweltering summer in 2003, when a preservationist foreman named Miller lifted the lid on a forgotten lead box and resurrected the ghost of Celeste. The discovery of her confession and William's private letters did not change the grand sweep of history, but it posed a profound and unsettling question. It forces us to look back at the celebrated lives of her children and ask, what is the true nature of a legacy? Can a life built on a lie still be considered a triumph? James Ashford fought for a people he never knew were his own. Hope Ashford championed the marginalized, unaware of her own mother's place among them. Their success was her masterpiece, a legacy of justice and progress paid for by a terrible injustice and a foundational lie. Celeste's story is a stark reminder that history is not a simple narrative of good and evil, but a complex, often brutal landscape of impossible choices. The law condemned her as a criminal, but in the higher court of love and sacrifice, she achieved a victory more profound than any legal verdict. Her story reveals the terrible price of challenging the established order, but it also illuminates the enduring, transcendent power of a mother's love. And it leaves us with one final, haunting question: how many other stories like hers remain buried beneath the floorboards of our history, waiting for the light? How many of our world's accepted truths are, in fact, built upon the silent, unmarked graves of forgotten sacrifices? The echoes of Celeste's life suggest that the past is never truly dead, and sometimes the most powerful voices are those that speak to us at long last, from beyond the grave.